The Holy Gospel according to Luke, the 16th chapter. Then Jesus said to the disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was squandering his property. So he summoned him and said to him, 'What is this I hear about you? Give me an accounting of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer.' Then the manager said to himself, 'What will I do now that my master is taking the position away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do, so that when I am dismissed as manager, people may welcome me into their homes.' So, summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He answered, 100 jugs of oil. He said to him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 50. Then he asked another, 'And how much do you owe?' He replied, 100 containers of wheat. He said to him, 'Take your bill and make it 80. And his master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. Whoever is faithful in very little is faithful also in much, and whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." The Gospel of the Lord. And please be seated. Well, yikes. What a parable Jesus puts before us in this morning's gospel reading. I'm not sure what gave me more heartburn this week, struggling with this difficult parable, or realizing that come Sunday morning I'd be standing here in the pulpit, you'd be there in the pews looking at me, expecting me to say something worthwhile about it. So you heard it for yourselves. A rich landowner tells his manager that he's going to fire him for mismanagement. Now, we don't know how long it took this employee to clear his desk, but apparently it was long enough so that he could make friends and influence people with the accounts with his boss. This manager realizes the bad place that he is in. Once he was on top of the world, but now he's about to lose his job and his means of making a living. By his own admission, he is too weak to dig and too proud to beg. And so, looking to create another option and some new friends for himself, the manager calls in those who owed his master and reduced their debt, some by as much as 50%. Now, when the boss hears about it, for some reason, he didn't call his lawyer. Instead, he stood back and laughed in seeming admiration and commended the manager for his shrewd action. And what's more, Jesus goes on to tell those who are listening to this parable that they could learn a thing or two from this dishonest manager. Wow, right? I mean, this does not sound like the kind of thing we've come to expect from Jesus. But here it is, right there in the Bible. How could Jesus tell us a story where the hero is a crooked manager? Why did the boss commend this bad manager? And what on earth is Jesus trying to teach us? Well, parables, as you know, are stories that Jesus tells. And he takes very ordinary things from our everyday lives, but Jesus gives the story a twist or a surprise ending in order that we might see things in a new or transformational way. So maybe Jesus doesn't want us to emulate everything about this manager. Maybe there is something, one thing, that Jesus wants us to know and appreciate about him. In this parable, the manager is commended by his boss for having acted shrewdly. And the word shrewd here could also be translated as wisely or prudently. And so it seems that that's what Jesus wants us to pay attention to here. This manager takes a circumstance that appears to be a dead end, and he acts creatively and wisely to create a new possibility. Instead of just being a victim of his circumstance, he transforms a bad situation into one that benefits both him and others. This manager realizes that he has all of the master's riches, wealth at his disposal. And so he takes what belongs to his master, what's been entrusted to him, and he uses it to create new possibilities, new relationships, and new life for himself and others. He forgives large sums of debts owed, thereby creating a new freedom for those who were once in debt to the owner, but also creating new possibilities for himself. He's created new relationships where people will now be hospitable to him. And for this action, the owner not only showed him mercy, but also commended his actions. Throughout the Gospel of Luke, the economy of God's kingdom proclaimed in Jesus creates new life and new possibilities where there were once only dead ends. Just before this parable, Jesus tells the parable of the prodigal son. That's one we all know and like. It's received a little better. In that parable, there is a son, not a manager, who squanders or wastes the wealth that has been entrusted to him by his father. But the father's unexpected and generous response of love and forgiveness and welcome, it creates a new possibility, both for the son and for the family, that holding on to punishment or bitterness or resentment could not. In the context in which Luke wrote his gospel, rich landlords and rulers were loan sharks. They used exorbitant interest rates to amass more land and wealth while disinheriting peasants of their family land. And this was in direct violation of the biblical covenantal laws. Did you know that the Bible forbids charging interest? We don't hear a lot about that. This rich man and his manager were both a part of a system that was exploiting desperate people. In contrast to this, throughout the Gospel of Luke, Jesus' ministry proclaims and enacts a biblical view of relationships, which includes lifting up the poor and the marginalized. We hear it in Mary's song, the Magnificat, when the angel Gabriel appears to Mary and tells her that she will be the mother of Jesus. Mary sings, "He has lifted up the lowly, filled the hungry with good things." And when Jesus begins his public ministry at a synagogue in Capernaum, he begins by quoting the prophet Isaiah. "He has sent me to bring good news to the poor and release to the captive." We see it in Zacchaeus' response to meeting Jesus. This little tax collector responds to the joy and the power of meeting Jesus by returning everything that he's cheated people out of fourfold. And Jesus says of that, Today, salvation has come to this house. As today's parable concludes, it's followed by 3 sayings of Jesus. And all of them make it very clear that what we do with what we have matters to God. But what leads up to all of that is this very complex parable. And I think that Jesus doesn't tell us simple stories because none of us lives a simple life. Our lives are complex, they're difficult, and Jesus honors our faith and our life by telling us stories that are complex and not simplistic. I think that when it comes to matters of wealth, most of us have some struggles, particularly as people of faith. I mean, just how much money is it right to spend on ourselves? How much do we dare to give away? How much do we need to save? How do we teach our children and our grandchildren to be both generous and wise with their resources? And in the face of such complex questions, Jesus offers not pat answers, but this parable of how wealth was used to create new relationships, new possibilities, and new life. And it makes me think, are we not also, as disciples today, called to use our wealth not simply to enrich ourselves or maintain the existing order of things, but to create new life and new possibilities, especially for those who are weighed down by circumstances that appear to them to be a dead end? At the core of this Christian faith we share is the understanding that everything we have and all that we are is a gift to us from God. Further, it's so important for us to remember that we have been bought with a price by the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And at the heart of our Christian faith also is knowing that we have been placed on this earth to love and care for one another and not to separate ourselves from each other with wealth or status or privilege. St. Augustine asserted that God gave us people to love and things to use, and sin manifests itself in our penchant to confuse these two, loving things and using people. This summer, I believe I was a witness to a beautiful example of wealth being used to move from dead ends to creating new relationships and possibilities. On Wednesday afternoons in August, United Lutheran fed a free lunch to our neighborhood kids. As you heard, it was led by Ryan and Shelley Pilon, and a great group of United folks turned out to serve. And it was evident that some of the kids who showed up were really hungry. They needed a good meal to eat. And other people came to find some connection, or others just to enjoy a beautiful day right out there on the church lawn. We learned in those gatherings that our neighborhood is very diverse. Most often there were more people of color than there were people that look like me, and it was beautiful. And as we ate together, we learned some of our neighbors' stories, like the young mother I met with 3 young children who moved here into our neighborhood to escape the gun violence in her neighborhood in Minneapolis. And now the freedom and release that she felt because her children could play outside without fear. And the local police officer showed up, and he put sticky badges on the kids. And he opened up wide the doors of his police vehicle, and he gave the invitation to come and explore it. And so children of all races explored together what was inside without fear. We invested our resources in feeding people, and in making connections in our neighborhood. And you know, as I looked out at our front lawn, the front lawn of our church, with people gathered together from our neighborhood across lines of race and wealth that might divide us, enjoying good food together, playing together, listening to one another's stories, building connections. As I looked at all of that, I thought that I glimpsed the kingdom of God. For where God reigns, old systems are overturned and new ways of relating are established, and dead ends become places of new possibility and new life. Amen.